right, next up in our viewer game analysis series, we are going to have a game between a 1700 with white versus a 2100 with black. And I love mismatch games because there's definitely in this game some elements of psychology of competition. And great preparation by both sides, as we'll see. And food for thought for both players. So let's go ahead and dive right in to where we are going to get ourselves a King's Indian position. And it's a classical. And here is a critical moment. Because often in chess, when you have a much higher rated player with black, he's got to take some risks. And being someone who's played the King's Indian amongst other openings for the better part of, 15 years, 20 years at this point, I will not play certain positions against much lower rated players. Because I know exactly what they're going to do if I play certain positions against them. They're going to choose the driest option that gives me little, small, almost no chance to win. And you have to work so much harder to beat them, and you may overpress and lose. From white's perspective, when you are outmatched this much, I understand after e5 playing d takes e5 and going for the exchange. Because it is quite a reputable line versus the King's Indian if you know the theory, and white clearly did. Clearly he spent some time working on this. But as you improve, there will come a time where black can make a draw by force if he wants to here, without effort. How are you going to pressure similarly, if I could say the word, rated opponents, as well as look to outplay opponents and get wins in the future? So it's kind of a double-edged sword. I like the idea in certain situations. I hate the ideas from an improvement perspective in the other. But overall, interesting game that we'll continue looking at. What I would recommend for black, though, because I can't tell you how many times somebody plays d takes e5, I added knight bd7 and knight a6 to my repertoire, and I vary it when playing the King's Indian against lower-rated players specifically, because after knight a6 castles e5, they think they're getting the same thing, but there is a absolutely huge difference with the knight on a6 because the c7 pawn is covered, and black already has equality where he can fight for a win here. And typically I've gotten it in my experience. So e5, de, queen takes, rook takes, bishop g5, and this is where that knight a6 would have been useful compared to the other variation where you throw in castle kingside for white and knight a6. But here we need to watch out for knight d5 stuff. And there are different lines for black here, but c6 makes a lot of sense. White's got a pawn in hand, so we need to fight for it. Knight a6, all this is theory. Hitting the knight again, so let's stop that and get development. Would you please go away? And there's two options here for white. First is the liquidating option, which is takes, you connect the rooks, and then start rushing the king to the center. And I definitely like this option for white. And then there's the main game option, which is the other theoretical option, which is keeping the tension. Takes, knight c5, hitting the e-pawn, so we simply defend. And everything explodes. And we get this mass liquidation. So it's interesting because we're 20 moves deep into a game with a 1700 and a 2100, and when you check ChessBase, you'll find a game from 2021 between a 2500 with white and a 2460 with black. And here, bishop b1 was played, and I'll quickly run through that game. You see white using the outside pass pawn to get some counterplay. And clearly some tactical stuff going on there. Maybe this was a rapid game or something, because that was pretty obvious pin. And I feel like it should have been avoided. But this endgame overall, since the bishop is out of play on h4, black goes on to win it by continuing to coordinate pieces. And yeah, it's easy to see how black comes away with the win in this one, because all we have to do is continue pushing the pawn up, and white doesn't have time to create enough counterplay with his passer. In the main game, b3 was played, and bishop d3. So we've definitely gotten a liquidated game, and it's a good point to ask here, who's better and why? Well, we've got 4 pawns all. White has 2 pawn islands, so does black. But the key feature in the position is the outside passed h-pawn. And it's a question of when should we push this pawn in order to try to create counterplay. You saw the GM do it almost immediately in his game, and he kept the complications with the bishops, which ended up burning him as he missed a tactic. But in this game, there's been a lot of liquidation. And from this point after king f7, I see the next move made by white. It gives me the feel of maybe there was time pressure, maybe a lot of different things are going on here. Maybe it's just I'm playing against a much higher rated opponent and I'm satisfied with the draw. Not quite sure. But rook d1 was played, and I feel like the rook was in a pretty decent location to support the push of the passer. But after rook d1, takes, black is, I guess, still trying to win it here. I mean, we've got an h-pawn and an a-pawn hanging. King e6, king e2. Not really quite sure. King d5. And then here is another opportunity. h4. And this should be a technical win for white, since it's same color bishops. And a brief line to show as black is making progress, so is white, and black is eventually, I mean, we get on the blockading queening square. Black's eventually going to have to play f5 to watch the square of the h-pawn. So we'll have an extra pawn in hand, and playing with a table base, white wins here. But it takes a lot of work to win this type of position. But it all came down to the idea of passed pawns must be pushed. But after king d5, king d3 was played. b6. Again, h4 should win in the long term. And it's noted by the submitter of the game, I was too scared to play this, but it's winning, according to the engine. Psychology of playing a much higher rated opponent. And I talk a lot about psychology of competition with my students, and the major takeaway when you're playing someone who is 300, 400, 500 points high rated, you have nothing to lose. Nothing. Everyone expects you to lose. You're typically going to lose. And if you lose, it costs you maybe 1, 2 rating points. So there's no risk. On the other hand, for your opponent, it's like 20, 30 rating points, a huge risk. They don't want to have to play you at all. I can say from experience, if I was playing black in this game, as soon as the exchange variation was played, I played e5 hoping to get something aggressive and nasty, and d takes e5 was played. It would be like the Robert Downey Jr. meme. Just, I would immediately be like, well, why am I even playing chess today? Because I'm going to have to work really hard to win this game to get absolutely nothing for winning. It's a terrible life. So, change the psychology a bit in looking at it that all the pressure is on the higher rated player. And you need to think of yourself as using their momentum against them. If you're going to play a very dry opening like the exchange, you've got to have the psychology of, as soon as the position gets easy enough for me to understand, I'm going to try to beat him. So, a little bit of a change there, but after b6, bishop g1, a4, and black's making progress towards getting a passed pawn, and white now feels the need to, but he already had one. g4 is actually a losing move for white because it allows black to create a second passer. And we're going to have an extremely anticlimactic conclusion here because I was not provided the full game score because of time trouble after king e2, but the note says, I'm lost here. I agree. And I stopped noting here, but my opponent ended up flagging when I had just a bishop left, so the game was drawn. So with perfection, black can come away with a win here because white's pawns are much slower than their counterparts. But overall, I really enjoyed going through this game because there's more off-the-board psychology with ratings, opening selection going on with this game. And overall, I was impressed that you're essentially following 20 moves of theory that either two GMs or a GM and an IM were following in a recent game. So respect to the players there for knowing the theory or just figuring out as you went along from intuition. But yeah, for our player playing white who submitted the game, definitely change the perspective. Always go for the win.